The second panel is nominally titled Domestic Political Landscape. It's a discussion of the beliefs about other countries and the sentiments people feel, their fears and aspirations, and the preferences they have for foreign policy across both Europe, in Russia, of course, and in the United States. And we have three terrific people, terrific scholars whose work I've read. I'm very happy to meet Marlene this morning, and Matthias virtually. I've known Mary Serrati for quite some time. So thank you all three for coming. Let me tell everyone else who hasn't met you who you are. Marine Laurel is the director of the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies and director of the Illiberalism Studies program at the Elliott School of International Affairs at George Washington University. She's also the director of the Central Asia program at GWU and the co-director of PONAR's Eurasia. She's recently authored Russia is Fascist, Is Russia Fascist? Unraveling Propaganda East and West, and has previously authored many books. And again, if you look at our website, you can see them all. She's going to speak first. Then Matthias Madar is Associate Professor of International Politics at the University of Constance. His current research, he collaborates from a researcher from 9 European countries to examine the dynamic relationship between elites and masses in policymaking about common defense in the multi-level European system. And this project, Fighting Together, Moving Apart, European Common Defense and Shared Security in the Age of Brexit and Trump, is funded by the Volkswagen Stiftung. He's authored 3 books and many articles, and again, I refer you to the website for more. And Mary Serrati, who will finish the presentations to get us started this hour, is the Marie-José and Henry R. Kravitz Professor of Historical Studies in the Henry A. Kissinger Center for Global Affairs at the School for Advanced International Studies at Johns Hopkins University. She's also a research associate at the Minda Gunsberg Center for European Studies at Harvard. She's the author of 5 books, the most recent of which is Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and the Making of the Post-Cold War Stalemate that Yale University Press published just last year. So without further ado, I'm going to turn the floor over to Marlene, who will lead us out.
Thank you so much, Richard. Thank you for the invitation. Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I was asked to speak about the kind of the Russian public opinion on foreign policy. I'm not a specialist on Russian public opinion. Usually I'm studying more the kind of ideological landscape of Russia, but I try to do my best to try to bring all the nuances that we need to have when we look at the Russian public opinion. Let me share my screen. Yeah, I should be seeing it now. Have it full. Yes. So first, would like to begin with a kind of broad discussion on the kind of structural feature of European public opinion. First, of course, the informational space, and I think that's a key issue, but I think it's not the only one. And I think when we tend to speak about the Russian public opinion, we are looking at what is the information space, and there are other kind of more deeper structural, cultural features that are important to have also in mind. So for very long, the Russian system was pretty successful to avoid a too open repressive toolkit in terms of media control, and to compensate that with more a strategy of media saturation and of co-optation of media and of journalists in trying to offer a system where the whole information, a large part of the informational space, would be saturated with official narratives and not too much repressive strategies, or at least only a targeted repressive strategies. Things are beginning to really change in a more drastic way in 2019, and of course, since the beginning of the war, the repressive turn is obvious. And I think that's important to keep this strategy of media saturation in mind if we want to understand the kind of Russian support for war, or support for interpreting what the Kremlin is presenting as the key element for the so-called special operation. We were also mentioning in the little blurb of our panel the issues of mobilization prospect. And here also, I think it's important to keep in mind that until 2021 and Navalny arrest, and even after that, there was a really impressive wave of urban activism and local protests all over Russia, and not only in Moscow and St. Petersburg, but in a lot of regional provincial cities. And we were really able to see an impressive revival of this kind of grassroots local activism, also impacting the way municipal power was negotiating. And that was, I think, a very encouraging element. So even if the regime was kind of activating more repressive policy, there was a kind of grassroots activism that now, of course, will probably has been stopped, even if we had very courageous anti-war protests. But now the level of the legal repressive toolkit is at such level that it will be very difficult for people to mobilize. And then what I think is also very important, and to move beyond these debates about like the Russian public opinion is shaped by the media propaganda machine of the Kremlin, which I think is only, it's a small aspect of a broader discussion, which are that you have kind of broader, deeper, long-term cultural, societal elements that explain what Russian public opinion thinks of foreign policy. It's still a society with, I think, very impressive resilience mechanism. And I was reading a survey done like 2 weeks ago asking how people would be dealing with the disappearance of foreign brands in Russia and a kind of change in their consumerist habits. And the majority of people were saying, at least they were that what they were saying. And of course, we can discuss the how much we should rely on surveys done in the current war context. But people were saying that they would be fine managing the disappearance of brand and of this kind of consumerist culture. And so I think it's telling a lot about the still existing resilience mechanism that are kind of were built both during late Soviet period and the 90s. We had still a very strong political passivity. As I was saying, it was kind of diminishing at the grassroots level, and a kind of tradition of kind of moving toward private life to try to avoid confronting too much the political situation. And then globally, and that's not a specific case for Russia, the public opinion tends to be more easily in support of the foreign policy than it is on domestic policies. And here also, I think it's trends we see in European or American public opinion is that people tend to be more critical when it's discussing domestic issue, that they can interpret themselves in their everyday life, that when it is about discussing foreign policy, where they tend to kind of support what is the official narrative. And then I think we have long-term worldview trends that are important to keep in touch and in fact to keep in line. And we were mentioning several of them during the first panel. There is a global and kind of deep-seated distrust toward the West's intention toward Russia, based on the idea that Russia co-created the post-Cold War order, but was not rewarded for it. And of course, people may not express it in such kind of a crispy expert type of narrative, but I think there are these strong feelings in a large part of the Russian public opinion that Russia hasn't been rewarded from the way it has been able to have the Cold War system involved. Then it has strongly liberal worldviews, and as it was discussed during the first panel, I wouldn't read this illiberal worldview as a kind of really genuine kind of social conservatism aspect. I think it's a very much a situational illiberalism that is based both on the memory of the 90s and on the fact that liberalism has been interpreted as being a Western normative pressure put on Russia. So these illiberal arguments, these illiberal trends are really to be put both in a kind of, in their relationship to the West and in their relationship with the time and the 90s. And then a kind of global easy acceptance for conspiracy theories, which he also think have a lot of their roots in the way the Soviet Union collapsed and the way it was framed in the 90s and how it was difficult for people to interpret the collapse, and therefore that kind of create this kind of fertile ground for trying to read the world through a conspiracy theory. And here also, I'm not sure it's very specific to Russia. I think some other societies like the American one have a very strong conspiracy-oriented worldviews. When we look at the Russian public opinion survey on foreign policy, I think it's important to realize that it's difficult to know if people really care and at which level they care for foreign policy issues. I'm just showing you some surveys done in 2017 where people were asked what would they prefer Russia to be. And you can see you more or less have like 40 versus 50-something% of people saying like, okay, being a great power that other countries respect and fear matters, but still a majority of people saying that what they want is a kind of modern country with good living standard, even if it's not an issue of great power. And I think it's important to have that in mind, because then, of course, people about their foreign policy perception, we have to keep in mind that maybe that's not what they matter the most for their vision of Russia. And you can see in the second survey what it is to be a superpower. It's the well-being of citizens, it's the economic development, and military power is still pretty important, but arrive only third. And here also it's things that are evolving, that are in flux depending on the evolving foreign policy situation. And of course now the military power would probably be higher, but it's still important to keep in mind that it was not necessarily the first key element for the Russian public opinion. When we look at the pre-war public opinion toward the US, we have seen a lot of these kind of back and forth waves of anti-Americanism. And here also, I think we tend to see Russia's public opinion anti-Americanism too much as something that would be very solid and stabilized. I think it's much more in flux. It's depending on the situation. It's kind of sometimes increasing, sometimes decreasing. And what was interesting is that in 2019 and 20, it was pretty low. So you can see that it's not a kind of permanent feature, and that even if the regimes has been manipulating anti-Americanism at a pretty kind of stable level, especially if you look at for like the media, the talk show rooms, the public opinion was much more in flux in its relationship toward the US. Another element that I think is important is to look at the different age perception, and so that we have really kind of generational division on the perception of the US, the EU, and here it's the case of Germany. You can see that younger generation are much more positive, both about the US and about Europe globally, than older generation. And here also, I think these generational cleavages, they are important to keep in mind globally. And here also they are in flux, but globally, the younger generation are always more open to other countries than the older generation. What we have elites, I think, is an interesting phenomenon. I think the elites are quite polarized, but still united. And of course, they have been, I will discuss what happened since the war. We have good surveys showing that you really have different groups in terms of the Russian political elites, with a kind of what I would call a kind of civilian or technocratic branch of the Russian political elites that is more liberal than what is the official state narrative, and that would be, or that were more in favor of kind of a detente with the West, and another groups of more kind of the military intelligence security realm inside the Russian political elites that was more confrontational. And that was, I think, so this polarization was really pretty visible, I think, during the pandemic's time also, where the technocratic elites were much more focused on trying to manage, for example, the pandemics, a crisis, while the military intelligence security realm was really more focusing on the kind of confrontational policy toward the West, and the kind of securitization of history and memory that we have seen kind of growing. What do we have now with the war? And of course, it will be more and more difficult to get surveys done in Russia and to assess if we want to believe them in the current conditions. So I think we should be cautious on the way we look at surveys now. As you know, now in Russia, it is about special operation, not about war. So when we ask people what are they supporting, they are supporting the special operation. They are supporting what they see on television, which is only a very small side of the war as we see it on the West. I think there were good surveys done, you know, in January, February, just before the war, where we can see, but where the tensions was already kind of mounting. And people tend to consider the West more than Ukraine responsible for the ongoing crisis. And I think that's important to see now how it has been shifted. But there was a kind of broad support for a narrative on Ukraine has an ultra-nationalist regime. It was not necessarily framed as a Nazi regime before the war, and that there is a kind of ongoing genocide against Russian, ethnic Russian in the Donbass. So these elements were largely supported by the Russian population, but there was no military support for Donbass. So when people were asked, would you like Russia to kind of militarily support the Donbass, the level was pretty low. That was kind of end of January, early February perception. And then, of course, with the entry in war, we have a kind of relying around the flag effect that is lower than the one we had in 2014 largely. I think there is no enthusiasm. It's a rallying around the flag more as a kind of passive choices, but we have seen, so this latest number, like 69% supporting special operation, 83% supporting Putin. Here also, as I was saying, we can question the legitimacy of this survey, but they are still showing a kind of trend of consolidation around the leader in a time of a crisis, even if it's not the Crimea effect. There are clearly falsification effects. So people are probably, part of the people are afraid to say they are not supporting the special operation, but there was an interesting experiment done by the London School of Economics that you can see online, and that was showing that even if you take into consideration this kind of preference falsification, you still have more or less half of the population in support of what they think is the special operation, which still tell you that even with all the media pressure that you have today in Russia, you have a large part of the population that is not supporting of the special operation. And when we try to do kind of phone surveys to try to capture how those who are not in support of the war are framing it, I think there was interesting nuances. We, for example, had several people saying like, and of course, it doesn't have any statistical representativeness, but people saying, I'm against the war, but I will not take any risk to go protest because I don't trust the Ukrainians. The Ukrainians are not friendly to us. So I won't put myself at risk in the name of Ukrainians whom I don't trust. So you see, people can buy part of the state narrative and at the same time be against the war. So I think it's only very important to try to take into consideration all these nuances of the Russian public opinion perception. I think what we have very strongly is a kind of cognitive dissonance on the Russian public opinion side in trying to realize that, okay, the special operation seems to be a very serious one. It will have long-term consequences. So it's a war, even if it's not framed like that by the media. I think it's very difficult for people also to accept the idea that Russia is the aggressor. I think it's contradicting so many strong cultural elements of seeing Russians as the liberator nation, not as the aggressor, that it will be really difficult for people to accept this, to recognize that. And you may have seen a lot of people reporting, you know, conversation between member of the family in Russia and member of the family in Ukraine, and people refusing to believe member of their family in Ukraine telling them they are under the bombs. And I think we have also to try to think about what this kind of cognitive dissonance means on the Russian side, how all the question of to which degree are the Russian population guilty or complicit of having supporting that. That will be a very long-term discussion, maybe more at the elite level, but I think also it will have some resonance into some part of the population. It will be a very painful discussion and it will take years. And then at the elite level, what seems to be emerging, but here also it's very difficult to try to read what is happening now, is that some elite consolidation. I think the sanctions are having the contrary effect that the West is thinking they should have, which is that they are consolidating the elites around the regime with this idea that, well, if you cannot go in the West anymore, if you will be kind of cancelled, your assets are safe, then it means your future is in Russia and your future is to kind of side with the regime and trying to survive the storm, because there is no other way to, there is no option of exiting Russia for many of these elites, which means that the survival strategy means that now the war is existential for many of these Russian political elites, and they have to go through it and they have to get some kind of victory. And I think one of the big issues will of course be which kind of face-saving strategy would appear as a good victory on the Russian side. And I'm not sure the way the West has been framing that in this very ideological term will help finding a solution. I will just stop here. It was very broad overview. I hope it was helpful, and I look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That was a terrific start. Matthias, I think I'm just going to move the floor directly to you.
Yes, absolutely. Thank you very much for the kind introduction. It's an absolute pleasure to be here and part of this all-star panel of speakers. I have already learned quite a bit. I was asked to speak on public opinion in Europe and kind of do what Marlene did for Russia. When I started thinking about what I wanted to say, it was for me like for Fyodor said, like he said this morning, the Ukraine war did not happen yet. Right, so I was thinking of talking about this long-term perspective of public opinion on security and defense in Europe. In 2003, Richard Eichenberg wrote this wonderful piece on the topic, and he said, well, Europeans wanted both ways. They want a commitment to NATO, but they also want more European defense integration. And if you look at more recent public opinion data, you don't really see a trend. It's still true. Europeans still wanted both ways. That would be the very short summary of what I wanted to say. But then the war in Ukraine happened, and I have succumbed to the temptation to talk about this more current topic and ask, well, very much like Marlene, what was opinion before? What was it after? So let me also share my screen now. I've prepared some slides as well, and I thought I could guide what I'm saying using two quotes. And the first one is from the German Chancellor speaking in the German Parliament right after the invasion started. And he said, we are experiencing a turn of the times. And this is kind of what I'm interested in. Do we have a turning of the times at the level of public opinion? Now, Chancellor Scholz is a lawyer by training, but he could be a social scientist because he provides a key definition, a definition for his key concept, that is turn of time. So he says that means that the world after is no longer the same as the world before. I mean, we can come back in the end to the question of whether this is a good definition. But for now, this is what's going to guide me, right? I will look at public opinion before the war started and at public opinion after it has started, although, of course, the data is still quite patchy, especially if we are talking about, public opinion in Europe, which is many countries, and we don't have that many surveys done already in a very systematic fashion. Now, the second quote that I think is interesting is from Ursula von der Leyen, the current president of the EU Commission, which kind of adds some substantive content to this diagnosis of a potential change, right? So she said, if Putin was seeking to divide the European Union, to weaken NATO, and to break the international community apart, he has achieved exactly the opposite. So what I will try to answer is, at the level of public opinion, is this what we are seeing? And for that, I brought public opinion data. And here's the first one. I will start with perceptions of threat. I will kind of skip this question of who are friends, who are foes. Very briefly, Russia was not popular in the European countries even before the war, whereas the United States has been looked at much more warmly, right? And this is true for essentially all European countries. When we talk about threat, this is data from October 2020, you see that most European publics thought that Russia's territorial ambitions were a threat. In many countries, we have majorities saying that. We do have variation too, and I think it's important to point out that it's not as easy as saying, well, the Eastern Europe is like this and Western Europe is like that, because in fact, the countries at the very top and the very bottom of the distributions come from Eastern Europe, right? So we have some Eastern European publics who see Russia very much, or saw Russia very much, as a threat, whereas in other Eastern European countries, that was different, and they did not see that threat as vital. Now, we know from research that when we show citizens these large lists of potential threats, that they tend to say, yes, well, now that you mention it, I feel quite threatened by it, right? So a bit more informative than these kind of rating results is a ranking of potential threats. So let's compare what people say about the Russian territorial ambitions and other potential sources of threats. And there we see that at least at that point in time, other things were more present to the European publics. I mean, here we have diseases and pandemics, right? This is the first year of COVID that is perceived as more threatening. But also climate change has also been perceived as more threatening. So comparatively speaking, other threats ranked higher before the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Turning to policy attitudes, support for NATO was high for a long period of time. Here I'm focusing only on the large European countries, but it's kind of similar for smaller European countries too. So even during the Trump presidency, during the brain dead era of NATO, we have continuing general support at the public level. But then again, right? What if we go a little bit deeper? What if we look at the commitment to actually defend allies or friendly friends? There the picture looks a bit different, right? So this survey item asked respondents to imagine a situation where a Crimea type situation happens in Latvia, and then the question is, would you support your country sending troops to secure the Latvian border? And as you can see, the willingness to take such more costly measures is really weak. It's essentially only in the other two Baltic states that majorities support doing this. Poland around 40%, And then it goes down from there. And in many European countries, we are at kind of 20% of the public who would support this. And this is actually true also if we kind of look into societies, right? For example, if we divide by general political ideology, by left and right, we still don't see, you know, large sections of the public within countries that would be more in favor of doing this. I mean, this is a very, you know, coarse approach in a sense, because I'm just, you know, dividing the samples into these self-placements on the left-right scale. And the question is, what does that mean in Eastern Europe? But it does show, I think, that even if we look at sections of the society where we know that people tend to be more willing to use force, then we still see that the willingness to send actual troops to defend a friendly nation or an ally was very weak. Okay, now let's see what we know about actual shifts before the Russian invasion and after the Russian invasion. And perhaps not surprisingly, threat perceptions increased quite a bit after the Russian invasion. I mean, that's probably not so surprising. But what we do see also is a kind of, you know, that the distribution is becoming more similar. I mean, France and Germany still lag behind in the level of threat they perceive, but they are closer now to the other countries right there. So there is a catching up. I'm pointing this out because, as Ursula von der Leyen claimed, there was a uniting effect of this invasion. And at least at this level, we have some evidence, some preliminary evidence on this. Similar for NATO support, that increased as well, even in non-member states, right? Sweden is of course not a NATO, currently not a NATO member, but at the elite level, there are discussions of joining NATO, Finland too, and there seems to be some kind of public mandate for that. Although, at least in this poll, there is still not a majority supporting this, but there are other polls that show even higher numbers. And finally, maybe most interestingly, also this question on, you know, the willingness to defend an ally or a friendly nation has also been repeated in a similar form in a YouGov poll. And here also we see quite substantial increases in support for doing this, but still it remains a minority position. Only in Poland we have a majority who would support this, right? So we don't see a complete turning of the tide, if you like. Okay, so oh yeah. And I also brought some more, since I'm from Germany, please excuse my special interest in Germany, but I do think Germany might even be interesting in a more general sense too, because it's of course the largest European country and the one that has maybe shown the most dramatic policy shift, although it's maybe not going far enough. But if we look at German public opinion after the invasion, we see that the Germans largely support the measures that have been taken, the economic sanctions, the announced increase in defense spending, the arms deliveries. Apparently, but this is only a slight majority, Germans would also be willing to support a stop of imports of gas and oil from Russia, which are to this day continuing. But finally, what they don't like is actually taking a more direct hand in the conflict, which you know, is not discussed, but this would also not, you know, meet public support in Germany. So to conclude, in Western Europe in particular, Putin was not really seen as a pressing threat, intangible, yes, kind of present, yes, but not real enough to warrant a major policy shift. This was different in some of the East European states, but not all. And after the invasion, we see something along the lines of what Ursula von der Leyen has described. We have increased support for NATO, support for a more assertive Russia policy than we've seen before. Now, all of this is not yet, at least I don't think, an answer to this question whether this is a turning of the tide. And for that, let me go back to this definition. Now, what I would always stress if we are talking about a turning of the times is that change has to happen, significant change has to happen, and it has to be durable, right? It has to be permanent. And how permanent these shifts that we are seeing now are is something that I cannot answer, of course, right? Not enough time has happened yet. We have to look at public opinion data in half a year, in a year, in 2 years to see if the Ukraine war had a lasting effect and there really was a turning of the tide. I mean, it's not surprising to see these swings in public opinion now, right? I mean, the topic is at the very top of the political agenda. The media is full of this issue, and we know that public opinion is influenced by the information environment. And so the real test comes when, hopefully soon, the war is over and this topic fades into the background, at least for the general public. And I'm not so sure if we will not see a swing back, maybe not to the levels that we saw before, but I think this, willingness, for example, in Germany to supply other countries with arms and spend much more on defense, if this is going to last. I'm not sure. We will see. And that's all I wanted to say. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much. That was terrific. Mary, you're next.
Great. Just a quick technical question. I noticed in the chat that some participants were saying that the first speaker was still highlighted. I just wanted to make sure that that got fixed.
I finally figured out how to fix that.
Okay.
And I think you're now highlighted on my screen. I hope everyone else is seeing you as highlighted.
Okay, excellent.
I think we're okay now.
Want to give our participants good value for money here today at our forum. Yeah, so thank you very much for asking me to be here today. It's particularly lovely to see you again, Rick. Rick, at a crucial phase in a book project, I got some funding from the Mershon Center, spent some very happy months there working on a book project. And so it's really wonderful to at least remotely be part of this community again. Of course, the events are not the recent events are not a source of happiness. It is obviously truly tragic what is happening in Ukraine. Obviously, we didn't know this was going to happen when Rick set up this conference, but it makes it all the more timely that we're coming together to talk about these issues. So as many of you know, I recently published a book called Not 1 Inch, America, Russia, and Making of Post-Cold War Stalemate. And I obviously have been doing a lot of talks about that book. But there's one aspect that I haven't spoken about as much, and I asked Rick if I could focus on that here because it it's a theme that I think hasn't received enough attention. Understandably, I get asked to speak a lot about NATO expansion, about the controversy over Not 1 Inch, and I'm more than happy to talk about those in questions. But I wanted to shift the focus a little bit to the impact of domestic issues on the history behind where we got to where we are today. And so I asked Rick if I could be part of this domestic political landscapes panel which is somewhat unusual for me. But it became apparent to me as I was researching my book that it's impossible to talk about the history of NATO expansion without looking at the domestic politics of the key countries. Of course, Russia, Ukraine, Germany, and the United States. And so I ended up spending much more time in my book than I expected on these issues. So I would like to basically, I want to do two things. I want to go through just some key moments in the history where domestic politics inside crucial countries had an impact. But I also just want to start with a comment to Matthias Mader. I thought that was a terrific talk you just gave. It was extremely interesting. And it was interesting for me to see that only a minority of people inside France, Germany, Britain, Poland, and Sweden believe that they should defend Latvia. It was interesting to me to see that because all but the last of those are NATO members, and they are already committed by treaty to defend Latvia. So that suggests to me that there is a huge gap between the domestic understanding of those countries' external security commitments and the popular understanding that those respondents thought, this is up for debate. And I suppose that you could say the polling question, the way it was written, they may have interpreted it as, well, should we do this even though we do have Article 5 commitments? I guess you could interpret it that way, but I would want to dig down a little bit more and figure out, do they even know that there are Article 5 commitments? And one of the biggest surprises for me recently in the events I've been doing is the number of requests I've gotten from journalists simply to explain what NATO is and to explain what Article 5 is. As a Cold War historian, I can no longer remember a day when I didn't know what NATO was, but I have now been doing many, many media events for the past, since the book came out, which was the end of November. And I'm now no longer surprised when someone calls me up and says, can you explain what NATO is? And can you explain what Article 5 is? And so I have found myself repeatedly pointing out that the United States has given Article 5 commitments to 29 other countries as part of NATO. And this comes as news to smart people who just basically have not been paying attention. So I was interested to see your findings, Matthias, because in some ways they paralleled my experience. There obviously is some debate about Article 5, because Article 5 is, of course, the heart of the North Atlantic Treaty. It stipulates that all members will treat an attack on any member state as an attack on themselves. It does not stipulate that they will go to war. It stipulates that they will treat an attack on any member state as an attack on themselves. But obviously, there's a lot of different ways you can respond. We can see now, for example, the United States is using sanctions. So it doesn't per se commit, a country to military conflict immediately, but it is a very strong guarantee, and it is already in place in places like the Baltics. Opponents of NATO expansion at the time said, we really shouldn't give out Article 5 on the assumption that we'll never have to live up to it, because even though there is some wiggle room, it is still a very, very strong guarantee. And if push came to shove, and we have to defend places like the Baltics, that's going to be hard. So now push has come to shove, and so this question of Article 5 is now coming back into the popular consciousness. I was even invited to do on the podcast Fresh Air a crash course in NATO history. So I would just to repeat, Matthias, was very interested in what you had to say, because it's correlating with my personal experience, which is obviously not scientific, but it is correlating with my personal experience. And people don't realize these commitments are already in place to defend these places, or to treat an attack on them as an attack on the United States. All right, so I'm a historian, so let me talk just a little bit about the 1990s. So when I started researching my book on NATO enlargement, I thought I would be focusing, and I did, on some of the first new members. So East Germany, when it merged with all of Germany, on Poland, on Czechoslovakia, which of course became the Czech Republic, and Slovakia, on Hungary. But what I did not expect was just how early on Chechnya and Ukraine became important parts of the NATO expansion debate. And these Chechnya, now obviously we can debate to what extent is Chechnya a separate region, but I think this falls into the sphere of a domestic issue, right? As you all know, when Chechnya tried to break away, Yeltsin decided to use force to prevent that from happening and to keep Chechnya as part of his domestic polity. This was in 1994. This came on top in October 1993 of Yeltsin's decision to have tanks fire on his own parliament. And I was surprised at what an enormous impact both of these events had on NATO expansion, given that they were, at least on the surface, internal domestic Russian issues. But Yeltsin's decision to shed the blood of his political opponents, first in Moscow in 1993 and then in Chechnya in 1994, gave all kinds of ammunition to Central and Eastern Europeans who wanted to get into NATO. And they, behind closed doors, besieged Westerners. Now, Westerners held their tongues to a certain extent in public because they wanted to support Yeltsin and his democratization. But behind closed doors, the comments were scathing about Chechnya being a bad mistake, Chechnya being the end of hopes that Russia could ever reform, Chechnya being a sign that new Moscow was like old Moscow. And Central and Eastern Europeans said, you know, this shows that we needed NATO Article 5 yesterday because Moscow is, you know, rolling into Grozny in a way they're going to roll in on us. So it was a huge factor behind the scenes. As I said, it was not so much discussed publicly, but behind the scenes, it strengthened the advocates of a quicker and more assertive NATO enlargement enormously. And that development coincided with a domestic development in the United States that also had a huge impact, which were the midterm congressional elections of 1994. In those elections, the American Republican Party won a stunning victory on the basis of what was called a contract with America. And that contract was largely about domestic issues, but it did address NATO enlargement, and it called for swift extension of Article 5 to Central and Eastern Europe. At the time, there were many other alternatives being proposed for how to enlarge NATO. And this is one of the major themes of my book, that the discussion about NATO enlargement to date has, in my view, been too simplistic. Basically, you have people who think it was a great idea, and you have people who think it was a terrible idea. We referenced some of these people earlier, and then they yell at each other, and that's you know, it's kind of a binary Manichaean debate. What became apparent to me as a historian working in documents, many of which I got declassified for the first time, was that NATO enlargement was not one thing. There was not one way to enlarge NATO. There was a spectrum of enlargement possibilities known at the time, and some of them, I think, would have made more sense than what ended up actually happening. So, for example, there were various suggestions of a halfway house, such as the Partnership for Peace. Or the British, for example, at the time, pressed very hard on Washington to expand NATO once and only once. The British said, we should pick a big range of countries, put them in NATO and be done with it, because otherwise we're just going to have ongoing frictions with Moscow. And there was a big clash between London and Washington, in particular with Strobe Talbot as the primary Russia advisor to President Clinton. Strobe Talbot said to the British, that is absolutely the wrong thing. We need to do absolutely the opposite. We need to make abundantly clear that NATO enlargement is an open-ended process. And in particular, we need to make clear that it won't stop until it includes the Baltics. So there was an internal acronym, SIBROD, S-I-B-R-O-D, small is beautiful, robust open door. The idea being that you do the exact opposite of what the British are saying. You intentionally take the smallest possible number of new NATO members first to make abundantly clear that you're going to keep going and there will be multiple rounds. And there was a big clash between London and Washington over this, and I was saying, and London lost. And so this idea of NATO enlargement being an iterative process, an open door process that it clearly does not end, that clearly has many rounds, that was how Washington decided to enlarge NATO. But that was in contrast to many other alternatives being proposed at the time. I've only named two, there were many more. So I'm trying to add nuance to this discussion and say that we need to stop thinking about NATO enlargement or expansion as one thing, which is good or bad, because there were multiple versions of NATO enlargement on the table in the 90s. And to get back to my theme of domestic issues, that election in November 1994, when the Republicans won a huge victory, took back the House and the Senate, really an enormous victory, was shocking to President Clinton. He said, I felt like I had died, not least because it boded ill for his reelection chances. And that election, as I said, was based on a contract with America that called for a specific version of NATO expansion, which was basically giving our Article 5 as soon as possible. No halfway measures, no limits on it like the British wanted, nothing. And so it helped tip that balance toward a more assertive form of NATO enlargement that I think maximized frictions with Russia in a way that wasn't necessary. So in other words, my book is not an anti-NATO expansion book. My argument is that the problem with NATO enlargement is how it happened. And the story of how it happened is largely tied to these domestic factors, the violence that Yeltsin decided to use in 93 and 94 at home, and the elections. And this was really a surprise to me, then there was even an impact from the Monica Lewinsky scandal. Now, obviously, I don't mean that President Clinton was sitting there discussing NATO expansion with Monica Lewinsky, but what happens is once his relationship with her, his improper relationship with her becomes public, he is much more vulnerable. He needs a win. NATO enlargement is a big win. He is distracted. The whole foreign policy team is just, beside themselves because they used to be able to get time with Clinton to talk about European issues, and now all of his time is taken up meeting with lawyers about Lewinsky. Even when there are events where leaders of potential NATO member states are coming through Washington, in other words, events where usually the foreign policy team would be briefing the president, they don't even get to brief him anymore because it's clear the journalists at those events are going to use the opportunity to ask questions about Monica. So instead of briefings with his foreign policy team, he's briefing with his lawyers about Monica Lewinsky. So in other words, there gets to be a dearth of expertise on NATO expansion because it's being crowded out again by these domestic issues. So all of these I realized were huge factors in the NATO enlargement story. I couldn't just look at US relations with Poland or US relations with the Czech Republic. Obviously those are very important and I do look at them, but I had to look at these stories too. And then as in Russia, as the privatization process turns out to be hugely corrupt, particularly the way that natural resources are privatized, that further increases skepticism in the United States. Again, that is a primarily Russian domestic story, but